This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson Podcast. All right, welcome back to episode 3 of Cosmographia with Randall Carlson. This is the new podcast we have started. We got Randall here with us. What's up, Randall?
What's up? Well, it's the exact reverse of the vectoral summation of all terrestrial gravitational forces. Of course, it has to be referred to a specific set of geographical coordinates because obviously what's up to us is not what's up to the Chinese.
That's right.
So
God,
let it be
I
known
remember to stop saying that.
we are not flat Earth believers. In this
That's true.
podcast.
So what's up is not the same for everyone. All right. Well, what's up with you, Brad? How's it going?
Dark skies over here, man. I'll keep
Dark
it
skies.
I'm good.
All right. Good. So we have a great show for you people today. The topic is Atlantis. That's right. And, for many years, people have been looking all over the world for Atlantis. And Randall is going to begin laying out where to actually look. And it begins with the one account that we have, and that is from Plato. That's right. Randall?
Yeah, most people don't realize that, if you ask most people, almost everybody's heard of Atlantis, but you said, well, where did this story come from? Where did it originate? Well, as far as our own, our own scholarly understanding of it, it emanated from Plato. And the controversy has always been whether Plato meant it figuratively, metaphorically, that is, or literally. And there have always been two camps going back centuries, actually. Atlantis was a topic of discussion amongst various scholars of classical antiquity. So the question is it real or is it just a fantasy that he made up in order to illustrate his concept of the idealized political state? And that's really what it comes down to. So what you have to do is, if you're going to address the question of Atlantis, is you have to address the veracity of Plato's account. Did he mean it metaphorically or did he mean it literally? And to make that judgment, I think you have to go directly to Plato himself. So that's what I do. I go to Plato, and the Atlantis accounts showed up in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, and only those two. It's not long reading. I think anybody can just about read the two dialogues in an hour or less, 45 minutes maybe. But there's a lot there. There's a lot packed into that. There's a lot of details. And I think that this is what it comes down to is, the devil is in the details. And there's a reason. What you mentioned, Kyle, was people looking many different places for Atlantis without actually sticking necessarily faithfully to Plato's narrative. But Plato was pretty explicit about the origin of Atlantis, quoting from the Geologic translation of Plato's dialogues. We find this power, referring to Atlantis, this power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean. And there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles. Now, who's speaking here? This is an elderly priest speaking to Solon. And Solon was the Egyptian poet and lawgiver who went into a 10-year exile. I'm sorry, back up. I said Egyptian, I meant Greek. He was the Greek poet and lawgiver, scholar, philosopher. He did a 10-year exile in which he journeyed to Egypt. And it was while he was in Egypt that he supposedly heard the tale of Atlantis. And it was told to him by this elderly priest. And so when you speak about the Pillars of Heracles, there's no other. I've looked. There's no other reference to the Pillars of Heracles being anything other than the Straits of Gibraltar. What we see, let's go back to this. If we begin to look at the literature of Atlantis, what we find is that prior to the mid to late 70s, most of the books written on Atlantis and people addressing the question of Atlantis or investigating, trying to figure out where it was, looked to use that model. It's west of the Pillars of Heracles. As it said, as the quote said, there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles. So obviously that puts it to the west of the Straits of Gibraltar, somewhere into the Atlantic Ocean. And so that's pretty much where most of the accounts were orienting towards that idea. Well, in the 1970s, you had a number of things that were published, but one of them was a book called Atlantis, Fact or Fiction, which came out in 1978. And after that, that region sort of fell out of favor with researchers. And when you, in a moment here, I'll quote from the book, and so you'll understand why. But the result was that there was a marked shift in the emphasis occurring at that point. When the door was opened to abandoning the details of Plato's original narrative to look for Atlantis somewhere else. And, you know, the number of places that Atlantis has been proposed to have been existed is at least a dozen different places in various works. So anyways, then you got to ask the question, how far can you depart from Plato's account? How many details do you have to change before you're not really even talking about Atlantis anymore? You know, either the specific details, demonstrable details, are going to match Plato's account, or they're not going to. And if they don't, then let's not call it Atlantis. There may be, you know, there may be some very interesting work being done. For example, as we discussed earlier, the collapse of the Minoan culture on Crete and its possible connection to the eruption of Santorini, the volcano on the island that blew up with tremendous force and caused huge tsunamis and general destruction around the Aegean region there of the Mediterranean. So that is a very interesting and worthwhile study, but you know, is it Atlantis? Well, I mean, clearly, in that first major detail that Plato gives of it being, west of the Pillars of Heracles, well, you know, you've abandoned it. So, I mean, from there on, and how that was accomplished was by assuming, because Terra erupted around 960 BC. I believe, let's see, let me think. Yeah, it was around that time. So compared to the 9,600 BC of of the date given for Atlantis. See, because let's talk about the dating for a minute. We'll come back to that because I can show the actual quotes. But according to the Egyptian priests who were talking to Solon, the events that they're describing occurred 9,000 years prior. Well, given that Solon's journey to Egypt took place roughly around 600 BC, you know, you do the arithmetic and you come up with 11,600 years ago, or about 9,000 years prior to Solon's exile. So the assumption is, in order to make Santorini work, the assumption is as well, Plato somehow got his power of 10 mixed up, and what he thought was 9,000 years, or the Egyptian priest, somebody in there got confused, probably Plato or a translator later, and what was supposed to be 900 years became 9,000 years. So then if you do that, now you got to change two major details. You got to go be way wildly off on the timing, and, you know, you have to now go east instead of west.
Right.
So, but that's not to say that that whole event isn't very important, because it is.
Yes, it is.
So
doesn't he also kind of mention those? Doesn't he give the timeline like multiple times in the dialogues? And so you not only have to say you made a mistake, but he did it, but he replicated it like twice or something like that.
I think maybe 3 times. He references the timing. So somebody had to screw up 3 different times in the translation or whatever in order to get that to work. But here's I think the work that was played the greatest role in shifting the emphasis, let's say, from a mid-Atlantic region to everywhere else, was this work that came out in 1978 called Atlantis Atlantis Fact or Fiction. And there was an important article in there, and it's a good read. I don't concur with the conclusion.
Yeah.
But basically it was that this Dorothy B. Vitaliano, who was really a volcanologist with the United States Geological Survey, and she was the editor and one of the contributing authors to this book, Atlantis, Fact or Fiction. And the title of her chapter, her contribution was Atlantis from the Geologic Point of View. And here's the point she makes, and I quote from the book: "Inasmuch as all references to Atlantis stem from Plato and no other source, in deciding whether it is fact or fiction, or to put it another way, whether it is legend or myth, we are faced with 3 options. We can take everything Plato says quite literally, or we can take his words seriously, but not literally, or we can take Atlantis as purely and simply his invention."
Yeah.
So my approach to it was, well, what happens if we take every detail of Plato literally?
Yeah.
Not that I'm necessarily going to say that is the final or correct interpretation, but let's just see what would happen if we took every detail literally,
right,
as much as possible. So what they then did in this work was they referred back to the book that was published in 1882 that was written by Ignatius Donnelly. And Ignatius Donnelly was a congressman from Minnesota who was very interested in, ancient traditions. And literally he ran for Congress, was elected to Congress from Minnesota. And his primary motive in doing that was to be able to get to the Library of Congress, where he spent all of his free time when he wasn't engaged in his congressional duties. And as a result of this research, exhaustive research he did in the Library of Congress, he wrote 2 books. The first one was Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Second was Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel. So in Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, he looks at all of these different possible sources of information and data and evidence that could be most logically explained by hypothesizing this mid-Atlantic civilization, right? Okay. Then in Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel, he basically gets into what could have been the catastrophe that destroyed Atlantis. And interestingly, I read his 2 books, maybe 73, 74, 75, right? Somewhere right in there. They were probably had just been republished or reprinted or something. I think I've still got my old tattered paperback copies that I would have read. But it was in the Ragnarok, Age of Fire and Gravel, where Ignatius Donnelly proposes that the trigger for the catastrophe that destroyed Atlantis was a comet.
Huh.
Mm-hmm. So
he was onto it back then, huh?
Yeah. I think the man was ahead of his time.
Yeah.
That was like 1883 or 87.
Yeah.
He proposed that.
Yeah, something like that, right?
Way ahead.
So, anyways, what happened in the wake of that? It caused this. It triggered this huge interest in Atlantis, And in some ways, the modern interest or obsession with Atlantis, I could say, goes back to the publication of the two books by Ignatius Donnelly in the 1880s, because that really stimulated a revival of interest that has gone unabated to this day, and that's probably why we're sitting here talking about it.
Huh.
And you have people on both sides of the spectrum. Some people that just implicitly believe in it without even knowing the details. It's just it's a nice metaphor that maybe gives them psychological comfort or whatever, to think that there was this lost civilization. And then on the other hand, there are those who just completely dismiss it out of hand. Again, the true believers are probably no less ignorant than those who just dismiss it with a wave of the hand, who've never actually read Plato, never actually considered any of those details, but they think they know enough to have an opinion. And I've certainly seen a lot of that over the last few years.
Yeah.
You know, the thing, and it's not atypical. Somebody will say, well, I was listening to him right up to the point where he said the word Atlantis. And at that point, no, I discredited everything he said and I turned it off.
Right.
I maybe oversimplify a bit, but it's essentially variations on that idea. See, it's like, oh, Atlantis. No. It's, pseudoscience. You see?
Powerful belief is operating on both sides. The main difference between the two sides is one side has a lot more crystals than the other side does. Right.
I think you could say that. So I didn't go into it going, oh, I believe there's an Atlantis. I just got interested in it because, well, for one thing, I'm from Minnesota. So, I kind of have this empathy with Ignatius Donnelly, because he grew up not too far from where I grew up. But, after reading that, that was, I would say, were the first books I ever read on Atlantis. And it was just, at that point, I'm, 23, 24 years old. Something like that, 25 years old. And, like everybody in my generation, we'd heard of Atlantis. There was a really cheesy movie that came out about 1960 or something about Atlantis that might be fun to watch again. And that's the only movie I really remember about it. I know there's been a lot of, I think some Disney stuff, and, I haven't kept up with it. It's out there, most of it. And wasn't there a TV series at one point?
Probably. I know there was a Disney animated movie about it.
There was a Disney animated movie, and I think there was a TV series.
Probably.
But yeah, it seems to kind of go ebbs and flows. There'll be times when there's this, major interest and people forget about it for a while. I mean, certainly I know in the 70s, a lot of the sort of the counterculture hippie, mystical types, latched onto the Atlantis thing in order to, buttress. So anyways, about that point, I said, well, I just out of curiosity, I'm going to look into it. Could it have, because I didn't really know anything about it. So that's when I read Ignatius Donnelly's books and got introduced to the idea, I think the very first time, of a comet impact, causing destruction on the earth and so on. And then a few years later, late 70s or maybe about 1980, there were two more books that came out that were actually important about Atlantis. I can come back to those later. But so anyways, with that background of Ignatius Donnelly, in this book, Atlantis Fact or Fiction, they use Ignatius Donnelly's book as a starting point. So as Dorothy Vitaliano says there in her article in the book, since that book, referring to Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly, since that book is still being sold in bookstores everywhere and has provided the basis for numerous other works, it is desirable to explain why his literal interpretation of Plato's description is utterly inconsistent with modern scientific knowledge. Donnelly outlined 13 propositions, in support of which he then proceeded to marshal all kinds of evidence, which he did. Yes, he then, marshaled a huge amount of evidence, and it's remarkable how much was actually available back in the late 19th century.
Yeah. In the Library of Congress.
Yeah, exactly. Donnelly outlined 13 propositions, in support of which he then proceeded to marshal all kinds of evidence. Only 2 of these propositions are relevant to a geologically oriented discussion. Okay, out of the 13. And here's proposition 1, that there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, a large island, which was the remnant of an Atlantic continent and known to the ancient world as Atlantis.
Okay.
Proposition 2, that Atlantis perished in a terrible convulsion of nature in which the whole island sunk into the ocean with nearly all of its inhabitants. So those are the 2 propositions that they propose to address in this work, which is ostensibly to determine whether Atlantis is fact or fiction, right? So of the 13 propositions that Donnelly puts forth, they said, well, we're going to single out the 2 that have a geological basis to them. And if there's no geological basis to them, then the other 11 propositions are irrelevant. That's right.
Yeah. That's the argument they're making, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So then they go on, or she goes on to say, now bear in mind, there are articles that have been published within the last year or 2 discussing the paucity of our understanding and knowledge of the ocean floor.
Yeah.
And it is literally true that we have a much more detailed understanding and view of the surface of the moon than we do our own ocean floor.
Right.
Given that that's the case in 2019, now we go back to 1978, and this is what she is saying. In light of what is known today about the ocean floors, we can definitely rule out the possibility of a sunken landmass of any substantial size in the Atlantic, or for that matter, in any other ocean basin. It has now been established from the speed at which earthquake vibrations propagate through the Earth that the material of the Earth's crust underlying the continents is different from the material underlying the ocean floors, which is true.
Yeah.
Yes, it is, but it's a red herring. Now, she goes on to say, nowhere in the ocean basins is there any sign of a large mass of continental type crust, which could represent a submerged continent. Now, notice the terminology.
Yeah.
From an island, a sunken landmass, which could be of any size, from the term island to now a submerged continent. Right? So right here, we're setting up a straw man.
Right.
You see that?
I see it.
Sure. It's as plain as day. It's right there. We're setting up this straw man, a submerged continent.
Right.
Right. You know, and this is the kind of thing that a lot of the so-called skeptics like to latch onto, these superficial analysis of these various topics. And they're so filled with non sequiturs and logical fallacies. And of course, it all relies on people not being alert to that and believing that because it sounds authoritative, that it is.
Right. Yep.
So
even
then
if it was authoritative, it doesn't matter. That's appeal to authority in the first place.
It's the appeal to authority. Now, note with this next quote, note the tactic that's employed here. With an Atlantic site ruled out as physically impossible, all arguments based on racial, linguistic, or other cultural similarities on both sides of the ocean, which would include the rest of Donnelly's 13 propositions, must collapse. See? Either way, they are not real similarities at all.
Right.
Or they must be explained in other ways, including mere coincidence.
Oh, yeah.
So see, if we can dismiss the 2 geological propositions, then we don't need to even explain any of the rest of the stuff.
Yeah.
botanical or linguistic or racial or symbolical or any of the mythological, any of that stuff. We don't even need to address it because we've disposed of Atlantis by showing that there's no geological basis to it. So then what that then requires is that, well, okay, at that point we go with it and we say, okay, that's the end of the matter because, the geological authorities have spoken, right? There is no evidence for any of that. And therefore we trust the authorities. And from that point on, I can go, well, Atlantis, I heard them say the word Atlantis, so I turned it off.
Yeah. The dreaded A word is
the dreaded A word.
Yeah.
So then what I'm getting at then is, well, okay, then let's take a good hard look at the geological evidence. Let's not take it on faith.
Right.
That there is no that we can rule out the possibility of a sunken landmass of any substantial size in the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Let's just let's play the devil's advocate. Let's play the skeptic, and look at that. But before we do that, though, we have to actually go to the details of Plato's account because, what they're doing is they're not going. You'll notice they're not going to Plato's account. They're going back
to Donnelly,
a 19th century from the 1880s, right? Well, okay, so listen. He may have done an incredible job of scholarship, and he actually did.
Yeah. But
like so many, there's so many of these works of scholarship where there's two parts to it, and I hold, say, authors like Immanuel Velikovsky guilty of this. They do this tremendous job of assembling the data and the research, and these outliers within the order of things and pulling them together. That's the first part. The second part then is, okay, now that we've done this, let's interpret it. Let's try to determine what this means. See, so like Velikovsky's approach was to assemble all of this stuff that was known back in the 1950s, and then he attempted to explain it. So he collected all of this stuff together that, there had been this catastrophe or even a series of catastrophes for which the evidence was abundant. And now is orders of magnitude even more abundant. But then he went and tried to explain. And of course, that's where his critics savaged him. It was because his explanation, the astrophysical explanation that he invoked didn't make sense.
Right.
And so they attacked that. But in the aftermath, when the dust settled, his catastrophism was still there.
Yeah.
See? So they demolished his astrophysics, but they didn't do anything to dispel the catastrophism.
Right. Or the mythology stuff that he worked on.
Exactly. That's exactly it. See.
Right. So what you're talking about a bit of they're working on a fallacy of composition, where they try to say that because this person was wrong over here, everything else they were saying is also wrong.
Yeah.
Well, I want to know, why is there such resistance to the idea in the first place? Like what's driving the mainstream to just dismiss it out of hand?
Well, that gets us into, the psychology of the whole thing. And I think, where Velikovsky did, bring his professional understanding of the human mind to bear was in his work, Mankind in Amnesia.
Yes.
Which is a theme that Graham Hancock has picked up on, and in which I will admit I concur with that. It does seem like there is a psychological trait that doesn't want to know the truth of our own existence. That there's just like a person who's been through trauma may try to put out, suppress these memories. The idea is our species is doing this.
Yes, there's a collective trauma.
Something that we could do a future discussion about the genetic memory.
Yes, that would
we'd get off tangent.
Sorry about that
now, but it would be worth coming back to at some point for sure.
Yes.
So then 1995, this is when I first picked up the book Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham. And I was looking for for reviews of it, and I found this really snotty, condescending review of the book by L. Sprague de Camp, who I think is now passed away. It was published in the British science journal Nature, 1995. Fantastic archaeology, it was called. This is how he characterized the whole thing.
Okay.
As most good scientific fringers know, our civilization is not the first of its kind on this planet. Long ago, they say, there throve another technically advanced culture, enjoying many of the advances of our mechanized world now boasts: electric power, fast transportation, aircraft, and so on. But some cosmic catastrophe wiped out this culture, leaving Earth's survivors clinging precariously to Stone Age life. After the passage of thousands of years, human beings slowly climbed out of the Stone Age and began the process of developing civilization as we know it all over again. Now, notice the straw man that he's setting up.
Right, that they had planes and
I don't recall now, having now read Plato's dialogues, 7 or 8 times at least, that he ever mentioned electric power, fast transportation, aircraft, and so on.
Right. Or even in Fingerprints of the Gods was there.
Right.
Yeah, that stuff.
And then I presume that he's referring back to the work that we were just quoting from, Atlantis Fact or Fiction, pretty much as the establishment did from that point on, right? After the publication of that work in 1978, the establishment, if you will, the academic establishment basically took that now as a settled matter and no more need to discuss it, right? So,
right.
And so L. Sprague de Camp is picking up and reiterating that idea here as he goes on, and he says, some locate this prehistoric civilization in Plato's Atlantis, arousing snorts of derision from geologists and oceanographers. Yes, we've been hearing those snorts of derision. Well, that's what you do. If you want to make your case, without having to actually go into like a detailed factual evidentiary based argument, you just, snorts of derision. You've won the argument. So some locate this prehistoric civilization, Plato's Atlantis, arousing snorts of derision from geologists and oceanographers who cite the utter lack of any large submerged landmass in the part of the Atlantic where Plato placed his sunken continent. Others say that the concept and name of, in quotes, Atlantis, are not unsuitable if it is understood that the land submerged was actually in Palestine or Tunisia or Sri Lanka or Spitsbergen or ... And of course, at that point in 1995, L. Sprague de Camp was referring to all of the various alternate locations that had now, every one of those that he mentioned had been proposed as the location of Atlantis. And that even probably not even a third of them right there.
Yeah.
Maybe a quarter of the other places that were proposed. See, anywhere but from where Plato placed it.
But were those proposed as a result of that first book, Fact or Fiction?
That's what I was going to say. Yes. Like if the geologists are all snorting lines of derision.
Snorting.
then people are going to come up with other alternatives.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, so that's it. So, from the authoritarian perspective, oftentimes that is all that is required. It's just a good, well-timed snort of derision to completely disable your critic.
Yeah.
So the Bimini Road was found in the late 60s.
Yeah.
Is that right? The Bimini, so they already had an alternative to start steering people toward.
That's true.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So, then you start going through some of the literature, and there's way more than I've gone through. Excuse me.
No problem.
But enough of it to get the gist of what these alternate scenarios, how they basically rationalize their departure.
Yeah.
And so this came out a year after the L. Sprague de Camp article in Nature, which was 1995.
Okay.
This was The Sunken Kingdom, the Atlantis Mystery Solved. Okay.
Huh.
Now, this is what he says. The author was Peter James. And it's actually a good book. I don't agree with his final interpretation of it, but it's still an interesting read. So this is what he does. He says, nearly 2,400 years ago, the Greek philosopher Plato posed a riddle which has baffled scholars ever since. Was the story of the lost continent of Atlantis a complete fabrication, or did some historical reality lie behind it? The possibility of a real Atlantis, in the terms that Plato described it, has long gone. Now, this is 1996, so 19 years after.
Right.
For all of its romantic appeal, the idea of a prehistoric super civilization on an Atlantic continent is vanishingly unlikely. Well, yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
He's totally right.
If you're describing is this straw man that was invented, then yeah, I agree. Vanishingly unlikely.
Yeah.
But then he goes on to say, the improbability of Plato perpetrating a complete fraud involving deceased members of his family and the Revered Solon has led many to assume that there must be some substance to these claims. While Plato always added his own slant to traditional material, he has never been shown to be guilty of wholesale fabrication. Okay.
Yeah.
As the possibility of an Atlantic Atlantis became geological heresy in the 1960s, and yes, that's when you first encountered the comments. In fact, some of the people that contributed to this book, Atlantis Fact or Fiction, had previously written stuff, as much as a decade earlier.
Okay.
And this is why they were tapped to contribute to that particular book, who I think's purpose was at the outset to basically squelch these ideas, which at that time in the 60s and 70s were regaining momentum.
Okay, yeah.
In popular culture, right? So as the possibility of an Atlantic Atlantis became geological heresy in the 1960s, some scholars turned to the idea that the story was a memory of the glorious civilization of Bronze Age Minoan Crete. The explosion of the volcanic island of Terra, or Santorini, about 1500 BC, was argued to have provided the mechanism both for the destruction of the Minoan civilization and for an Egyptian belief in a lost kingdom to the west. Although, in his book, the author puts "to the west" in quotes, as if, to say, we don't have to really, literally think the west, because Santorini is to the north of Egypt. It's not to the west of the Pillars of Heracles. It's, anybody can look on Google Earth and find, and it's a very interesting, to pull it up. You can see it on Google Earth. I'll actually show a picture of it here shortly. In fact, I will actually attempt a screen share. How about that? How about that?
I have heard that it can be done.
Prepare yourself, folks.
This could be it. Let's see. This is a map of the Mediterranean, and I'm going to share.
Oh, yeah.
Hopefully.
Yep, we got it.
We got it. Okay, so there I've got the island of Crete marked right there where my cursor is. And of course, you can see right down here, this is Egypt, right? This is the country. So now you might go northwest from, the where the Nile discharges into the Mediterranean, but it's basically north of Egypt. Let's see here. Let's do this. There we go. So there's the island of Crete, and there is Santorini. That's what's left of the volcano that erupted with such force in 1500 BC. So that's what we're talking about right there.
So that's pronounced Terra?
Terra.
H is silent?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's so that people kind of know what we are talking about here. So then the author of this book then goes on to say, most theories about Atlantis have been constructed by believers who have identified its, in quotes, real site in myriad locations from the British Isles and Greenland to Carthage and Terra. On the other side are the skeptics who have dismissed the search for Atlantis as futile. Many years ago, I decided that the only way forward was to suspend any naive hope of finding a real Atlantis and to concentrate instead on the key questions: can we identify a source behind Plato's claims? And so that's what he did. But what he did is he ended up, as I said here, it was to Anatolia that many other clues began to lead, beginning with Atlantis, the famous titan of Greek myth, who was condemned to the edge of the world to support the skies when his race was defeated by Zeus and the Olympians. So I find it interesting that he says, most theories about Atlantis have been constructed by believers who have identified its real site in myriad locations in the British Isles, Greenland, Carthage, Terra. But then he goes on to put it in Anatolia.
That's Turkey, right? Modern day Turkey? Okay.
Yeah. So you can kind of see here. That's
but I really know where it actually is.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Yeah, so you said it was a short step from there to see what the classical traditions of Anatolia, and in particular Lydia, had to say about the, in quotes, original Atlantis. So now, and not to say that this book is actually a very interesting read in discussing some of these events that happened in ancient Anatolia. But then to try to tie that in and now then conclude that is what Plato actually meant by Atlantis,
right. In a different number of years ago and a totally different direction.
Right. And so this is how the author justifies it. There was already enough circumstantial evidence to vindicate Plato's claim that he had not invented the Atlantis story. True. Absolutely true, right? His putative source, Solon, could have picked up in Lydia, he could have picked up in Lydia, the story of Tantalus, which had all the key elements for its later exaggeration into Atlantis. And I will let, anybody listening to this to, do their own research into Lydia and Tantalus to find out how it more specifically could be interpreted by the author Peter James to become Atlantis. But from its fabulous wealth and transient empire to its catastrophic formation into a sunken kingdom. As Tantalus was identified with Atlas, the scene could have been mistakenly transferred to the far west. See, once in the Atlantic, the story of the sunken kingdom could grow uncontrollably during its retelling through the generations from Solon to Plato. So we have to then assume that if this particular author's interpretation is correct, that the story that was handed down from Solon through 4 generations to Plato, in that 4 generations, grew uncontrollably.
Yeah.
Right? And it was mistakenly transferred to the West.
Right.
I'm sorry, that's not my reading of Plato.
Yeah. So
again, this is an example of an interesting work, and the stuff. I read it. It was interesting. The stories about Tantalus and the mythology and how he's trying to tie it in, and how this city apparently is on the bottom of a lake now. So, but then you have to assume a lake, and that grows uncontrollably into an ocean.
Yeah. Well, we've seen how it happens with from an island to a continent.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy.
2 sentences is all it takes.
That's right.
Yeah. Here's another one. This was 1997, Atlantis, a new hypothesis. Others who do not consider Plato's narration to be an invention persevere in trying to interpret it in a way which would make it possible to link it with the already explored archaeological sites. Thus, some of them contend that none other than the island of Crete is Plato's Atlantis, claiming also that Greeks used the name of the pillars of Hercules, in this case, mentioned by Plato, not for what it is now called the Strait of Gibraltar, but for some rocks which were situated on the way from Athens to Crete. Well, there you can see how that you have to change the geography to try to, again, force it into fitting Plato's narrative.
Yeah.
So given such an interpretation, it becomes imperative for them to bring the date of the vanishing Atlantis given by Plato in line with the time of the decline of the Minoan civilization established by archaeologists and link it to the explosion of Terra on Santorini. Terra being the volcano, Santorini being the island.
Okay.
Hence, rise is given to the hypothesis that the span of time between the vanishing of Atlantis and the conversation between Solon and the Egyptian priest is actually 10 times shorter. And that the mistake was made either when Egyptian priests were copying the sacred records or because Plato himself, like all his contemporaries, had little sense of time and dating. Well, I might question that assumption.
But speaking of little sense of time and dating, we are coming up on time ourselves. So just letting you know.
Well, okay, so I think what we've done is we've established a framework for relooking Atlantis, because then what we're going to do, and I'm not going to try to do it exhaustively or to try to cover every single piece of evidence, just enough to give folks an idea that that those two geological propositions, their dismissal was premature.
Right.
Because we know, for one thing, what we already knew in 1978, to me, about the nature of the ocean bottoms and marine geology and so on, does not justify their sweeping claim that, there couldn't be a sunken landmass.
Right.
Because there are, in fact, sunken land masses throughout the global oceans. There's dozens of sunken land masses, okay?
Yes.
So sunken land masses do exist. That's not some fringe pseudoscientific idea. They're there, right?
Right.
So then the issue becomes, looking at the geological perspective, do we find that the geology supports or refutes Plato's specific details? So you have to do two things. You have to go through line by line of Plato and look at his details, right? What does he say about the geography? What does he say about the chronology or the timing? What does he actually say? I mean, nowhere does Plato talk about aircraft or crystal technologies or high-speed rails or any of that. He doesn't talk about any of that. What he actually describes is not unlike a glorified Minoan civilization, a maritime civilization that rose up on an island in the mid-Atlantic, and that there was a convulsion of nature. So at this point now in 2019, we absolutely know without any shadow of a doubt that there were maybe several convulsions of nature accompanying and forcing the global shift from the Pleistocene epoch into the Holocene epoch.
Right.
And the subsequent rise of civilization after these convulsions, these global convulsions. And that's the context we have to place this in. And what is interesting is that the date that is now given in the textbooks, in the geological textbooks, for the onset, the inception of the Holocene, the modern epoch, which is so distinct from the previous 2.5 million years of the Pleistocene epoch that it gets its own name, its own classification, and the date for that inception is exactly Plato's date of 11,600 years BP or before present. So again, coincidence? Well, yeah, well, probably, if nothing else,
Matches.
if nothing else corroborates it.
Yeah.
Taken by itself, yeah, that could just be a coincidence. However, as we'll see over the next couple of podcasts, there's a lot more supportive data that when we look at the actual geology and what is now known about the ocean and the ocean floor, what is known about plate tectonics, what is known about volcanism, what is known about isostasy and rheology of the earth, what is known about changes in mass distribution with the ending of the ice age, and why now are geologists pinpointing that date of 11,600 years ago as the most suitable date for the beginning of the Holocene.
Yeah.
So yeah, we will explore some of that.
Fantastic.
A lot of that.
And then we'll see who's snorting lines of derision afterwards.
Well, I think it would be apropos if we all now practiced our working on our snorts of derision.
Yeah, I'll practice it for sure. I want to get it down. So by the time we're done with the Atlantis series here, I'm going to be able to just nail them with a single snort.
With a single snort, you will be able to dismiss all your critics with a single snort.
That's right.
They will know when they hear that snort, they will know that any attempt to dispute is going to be utterly futile.
That's right.
They will know that they are dealing with a bona fide authority.
That's right.
When they hear that snort of derision.
That's right, of derision.
Yes.
All right. We should all work on our snorts of derision, people.
Work on it.
Yes, I would like to encourage to begin now working.
Yeah.
Hey, now stop that, you guys. You're encouraging me.
Yeah, we all need a little encouragement sometimes.
Yes, we do.
Classic.
Well, this has been great, guys. Looking forward to next week. I can't wait to keep going through this Atlantis stuff.
Yep.
We have to wait a whole week.
That's right. Tune in next week. We are the hosts, Brothers of the Serpent. We have a podcast too, Brothers of the Serpent podcast. Thank you, Randall, for your information. Thanks, Brad, for watching out. You're like the watcher on this show.
So far.
All right.
Watcher. Yep.
Watcher.
Every good show needs a watcher.
It does. It does.
All right.
Checker.
See you
Good night,
gentlemen,
folks.
next week.
Yep. Next week.
Excellent.